be annoyed with this with these busy Zoom questions, you please ask for the recording proceedings, and then let's move on.
Estamos archivando.
Estamos archivando. Muchas gracias. Bienvenidos los estudiantes y otros profesionales que están con nosotros. Welcome everyone who is in the room. We are starting this session of the third international meeting on corporate integrity and global legal regulation, the third edition of our annual meeting. In Spanish, the tercero encuentro internacional sobre integridade empresarial y regulación jurídica global. Special thanks to our co-coordinators of all those professors who made this event possible. Professor Danielle Anne Pamplona from Pontifícia Universidade Católica do Paraná, Curitiba, Brazil. Professor David Mendieta Gonzalez from Universidade de Medellín, Colombia. Y también los profesores James Cooper from California Western School of Law in San Diego, United States. And of course, other professors who are not in this session, but I will make a special thanks afterwards. I'd like to thank especially to Professor Justine Nolan for being here presenting the Australian Institute for Human Rights and also the New South Wales University in Australia. And Professor Manuel, también Manuel Bermúdez, por estar con nosotros, profesor de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Mayor de San Marcos, en Lima, Perú. Bienvenido a todos. Para presidir la sesión, paso la palabra al profesor David Mendieta y la profesora Danielle Anne Pamplona. For preside the session, I'll give the word for Professor David and Professor Danielle Anne Pamplona. And thank you very much for this great moment for us all in our careers. There are a few moments in which we have this opportunity to exchange ideas and have so qualified persons and professors and researchers in the room. So let's do our movement. Please be comfortable.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias al profesor Siqueira Pontes por la invitación a FACAMPI, una institución que conozco, tengo el placer de conocer y de haber tenido la oportunidad de hacer amigos a los invitados, a los profesores Cooper, Nolan, a Manuel Bermúdez, que además es mi amigo, a Danielle, y creo que este es un espacio importante, necesario para pensar temas tan relevantes como lo son los derechos humanos y la empresa, y verlo desde diferentes perspectivas, no solamente desde las problemáticas que se viven en Brasil, sino en América Latina y a nivel global. Y creo que por eso este evento es importante, es necesario y bienvenido sea, porque si tenemos problemas en común, también podemos tener soluciones en común. Profesora Danielle.
Eu gostaria de agradecer à FACAMP mais uma vez pelo convite que me foi feito, dizer que é um enorme prazer estar nesse painel com esses colegas, né, um painel definitivamente estrelado, e dizer que ao professor, especialmente ao professor José Pontes, que é sempre bom a gente poder contar, né, com os colegas e poder preparar aí um painel que foi tão bem pensado, né, tão bem discutido, justamente para brindar os alunos e a academia em geral com uma visão bastante importante desse tema de empresas e direitos humanos, que é um tema muito caro para a gente, em especial aqui no Brasil, que é um país na América Latina de tamanha relevância econômica e política, mas onde a gente ainda não tem sequer, né, o nosso Plano Nacional de Ação, ao contrário de outros países aqui na América Latina, e apesar desse marco normativo ainda não aparecer aqui no Brasil, nós temos aí empresas importantes que têm buscado, né, de uma maneira autorregulatória, desempenhar e desenvolver condutas que correspondam ao que a gente chama de responsabilidade social corporativa. Então, eu acho que vai ser uma ótima discussão e estamos aqui, então, no aguardo ansiosa para ouvir os professores. Muito obrigada, professor Davi.
Bueno, vamos entonces a comenzar este importante evento. Vamos a concederle la palabra a nuestros invitados. Adelante, profesor Cooper. Es suya la palabra.
Es un gran honor estar aquí con ustedes. Es un largo tiempo que no he hablado español, pero espero que con estos colegas podamos avanzar. Estoy muy orgulloso de estar aquí con ustedes, los estudiantes y los expertos, y estamos listos para empezar. Gracias. Entonces, mi presentación, profesor Mendieta, ¿sí? ¿Quieres, do you want me to start my presentation?
Por favor, profesor Cooper, adelante su presentación.
Perfecto. Gracias por la oportunidad. Ustedes pueden ver mi presentación, espero, y I'm here to talk about inteligencia artificial. I hope it's okay speaking English. This is an important issue for all of us. We hear so much about artificial intelligence, and I'm just so humbled by the invitation. Thank you, Professor Jose Siqueiros Pontes, and all the co-coordinators who have put together such a great set of panels. Today is all about business and human rights, and there is no more important business right now than artificial intelligence. Now, when I was growing up, AI, you know, the siglas for artificial intelligence, or IA, was Amnesty International. This was our main non-governmental organization. We remember the days of in '86 when Amnesty International had a large concert with the police and Peter Gabriel, and U2 took over from the police at the end. I remember I was writing the law school admission tests in another city in Canada where I'm from, and it was just when they won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Amnesty International, it was so fitting because the other secret policeman's ball and their various activities to get the word out about widespread egregious violations of human rights, it really made us think that the world was a smaller place. Now, fast forward to today, and we're all about artificial intelligence, the panic, the Chicken Littles, that the sky is falling. We are all completely freaked out. And remember, it was only since the 1950s, really, with Alan Turing, that this whole issue developed, and this whole area of science of machine learning and deep learning. It dates back quite a while, but it's less than 2 years ago that ChatGPT came out. And look at how generative artificial intelligence has changed our world, whether it's deep fakes or new scams, the kind of scandals and ways that no goodniks and criminals will be using our voices to steal from our families, the kind of fake kidnappings, the election scams, the misinformation that's out there. My co-author and I, Kashyap Kampala from Bangalore, India, wrote a piece not too long ago for The Messenger called "The Politics with AI, We Must Be We the People, Not We the Bots." And I put in right below here a picture that was released to the general public of President Trump getting arrested by the New York police. And what was amazing was we actually could believe that this was true. You see him running away. There's a series of pictures. We saw Pope Francis with a puffer jacket. We've seen some of the, just very odd, less dangerous pieces, but we've also seen the advent of all sorts of other nefarious ways that AI is being used. And it makes us wonder, what can we do to regulate? There's a real call to action to regulate, especially when the leading company, OpenAI, funded in part by Microsoft, just this week announced that they're moving from a not-for-profit to a for-profit ethos, the way that the company objectives have changed from what was a not-for-profit to a for-profit. And of course, people have left in the subsequent days, but there's a lot of just distrust of the different industries. We've seen LinkedIn not a week ago announce, and it was a front page story in the Washington Post, that they added an AI scraping, and you had to opt out, not opt in to allow it to scrape your information, your photos, but you had to opt out. So we've got a lot of lack of trust coming because of that. And so the post-World War II environment that we grew up in from after 1945, it was really this geopolitical reality of mutually assured destruction, with a bipolar world of weapons being pointed, nuclear weapons being pointed from the communist side and the so-called free world side at each other. That, you know, there was a kind of a peaceful coexistence towards detente, that nobody would take the crazy step of going on. It kept human rights on the back burner. Everything after World War II was about preserving peace, that the geopolitical realities of the Cold War and the superpower rivalry between the Soviet Union and its camp and the United States and the so-called free world or West, that they were really focused on either battles through proxies that wouldn't get to the point of nuclear war, or order as the overall organizing principle, so we never got to that ugly stage. As a result, issues of justice or peace, and we see it everything from, despite the talk shop that the UN was with promulgating a series of human rights through the International Bill of Rights, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and economics, cultural and economic rights, economic, social, cultural rights from 1966, which went into force in 1976. And I'm honored by having Professor Nolan here, and she will correct me with my dates, given her incredible expertise in this area. Justice was always on the back burner. Human rights protection, we set up systems, but it wasn't until after 1989 that we started to see justice become more prominent in issues, whether it was the comfort women of Korea during World War II and the Japanese atrocities, or the Holocaust accounts that the Swiss banks didn't return. Justice, and then with the geopolitical, the communications revolution with 24-hour satellite, the internet, social media, we started to see a democratization and a further fusing of importance of order as the organizing principle, if not one of the two, with justice. We saw justice becoming much more to the front burner. So what I want to talk about today is AI's turning that on its head again, that we took so many steps forward in terms of protecting justice, and there's so much more work to do, but enter AI, and now it's a game changer in everything, in all our hard-fought human rights protections over the years. So whether it's algorithmic discrimination, which happens in credit, it happens with fair lending, it happens with hiring and firing, it happens with rental, house purchases, property purchases. It happened, AI and the algorithmic discrimination in criminal justice is legendary now. So what I want to do is go through each of these areas as kind of like a sampler to get the discussion going and to get us to start to understand why regulation becomes so important. Now, we've all heard about the AI race between the various AI superpowers, the United States and the People's Republic of China specifically, less so with the EU. They've got a smaller industry, but there's an AI race of regulation also. There's now a race or a competition among regulators. So following on the GDPR, the General Data Protection regulation from the EU from several years ago, and now into this year's EU AI, Artificial Intelligence Act, we see the EU as the first mover, and then a more state-centric notion comporting with issues of harmony and societal stability that are more favored towards, say, the Chinese Communist Party, coming out of the PRC, and then the Wild West. Of course, the lack of regulation, if that should be the way to describe US policy or lack of policy, where they're leaving it up to the individual states and municipalities until there is some leadership at the national level. There is this race going on. And all these areas of law where human rights are going to be affected, whether it's criminal law, whether it's the workplace, whether it's in consumer law, whether it's in tort law or warfare, it's putting really our entire idea of human self-determination at risk. And with further automation, we're seeing an incredible just upheaval. And so that's a very long-winded introduction to get us to this. There's no secret that AI, the way it scrapes, the way it uses what already exists out there on the web through the various large language models and how they train on certain data, companies are using data that frankly already has discrimination and bias built in. I'm not the first to say that. There's lots of science out there that explains it. It could be racial discrimination, it could be gender discrimination, any kind of discrimination. And they're scraping bad as well as good information from the web. So they're going to get the good stuff and the bad stuff. And then some tech companies are trying to overcompensate. And I'll leave it to others to speak about that. I'm not a data scientist, but I played one on television. All right. The first is AI discrimination in sentencing, whether it's through racial profiling, so-called shot spotter software that was being used in dozens of cities around the US, less so these days. Chicago just recently outlawed it. It's using AI to see where gun shots are coming from, but it's not a perfect software at all, and it's ended up creating more problems than it's worth. Same with predictive policing. It wasn't 24 years ago that a Minority Report, the movie with that Steven Spielberg directed and Tom Cruise starred in, started showing us what the problems we're using prediction modeling, where those problems can lead in terms of our basic fundamental human rights, the rule of law, our basic principles of law. ProPublica, which is based in the San Francisco Bay Area of the United States on the West Coast, did an expose of some software that demonstrated the dangers of machine bias, that the bias by scraping information that's already got inherent discrimination baked in is being used by hundreds of law enforcement agencies, municipally and, hey, my apologies. It's being used municipally, it's being used in the state, it's being used in all sorts of other environments. And increasingly, we're in a situation where whether it's for probation after the criminal conviction, for issues of parole, for issues regarding recidivism rates and calculating these sorts of things, and the machines are getting it wrong. Now, there were some problems with this ProPublica study, but I want to just sort of give you an example of Vernon Prater, who was deemed to be lower risk for recidivism, going back to crime, than Brisha Borden. It turns out that even though he got the lower score by the machine, it was based on his skin color clearly, and her skin color also clearly, and it was actually Vernon Prater who went on to commit a more violent crime. And they used this as the launch pad in this study, but there have been plenty of other studies as well since then. Now, there are some problems with these studies, I will grant you, but I'll leave that for another time to discuss. This is just meant to be kind of an introduction and a survey of what's going on. With respect to employment and hiring and firing, and even just job place accidents, occupational health and safety, we're seeing the rise of robots and cobots. Cobots being automated machines that work alongside a human. And there have been several accidents in Germany, in South Korea that are well documented. And it really puts at risk this issue of the right to work and the right to a dignified wage, which are covered in the 1966 International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights from out of the United Nations, that went along with the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, together forming the International Bill of Human Rights. There have been several incidents regarding that, but there's also about the future of jobs. In April of last year, Goldman Sachs put out a report that some 300 million knowledge workers, people that are working at computers, those jobs are at risk in a post-AI economy, in a post-knowledge economy. Just 2 days ago, actually yesterday morning, Yesterday morning, the Longshoremen Association, International Longshoremen Association, which is the stevedores, the dock workers in 36 ports around the United States, all through the East Coast, down to the Gulf Coast, including New Orleans, went on strike. And here's a picture of one of the strikers on the left here from the ILA saying, machines don't feed families, support the ILA workers. This is a huge issue because much of the automation that's going on is going on in our ports, in our transportation systems, and there is a worry that these union jobs are going to be lost. So it's not just the knowledge economy jobs, it's also some more blue collar work jobs. Some of these people are independent contractors. They can't, the others that are being affected by this as well, later in the downstream in the supply chain. And it's a huge economic problem for the United States right now, especially with the election so close. The main issue, in addition to wages, the second issue is automation. And where the sweet spot is for enjoying economies of scale is automating bills of lading, automating customs and freight forwarding procedures, automating all the harmonization that the international trade rules under the WTO have been able to achieve worldwide by streamlining this bureaucracy. Machines can do it faster, machines can do it better. Even things involving national security and checking out what are in each of the in the containers themselves, the loading and unloading of containers, the scheduling of deliveries on these huge ships. All of that is being automated, and the ILA is super upset about it. And not to be confused that it's just a blue collar thing, it's a white collar thing as well. There were 2 Hollywood strikes last year that we all remember because you couldn't watch your shows on Netflix or see movies because there were work stoppages by both the Writers Guild of America and the Screen Actors Guild, also known with their attendant trade union, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. Together, they were worried about the future. For the Writers Guild, they didn't want ChatGPT and other generative AI programs based on large language models to replace them in developing scripts, because that could be done. And same thing with the Screen Actors Guild. They were worried about the likenesses of their faces, of their actions. So very famous actors didn't want to get replaced by themselves because of some of the contracts they had signed, didn't anticipate that AI could do it better, and that Hollywood would have the access, the studios would have access to their likeness and could reproduce it unless it was properly documented by their respective union. So, and prevented. So AI affecting both blue collar and white collar jobs. And originally we thought, okay, you know, some blue collar jobs are going to get replaced. It's actually the law jobs also that are getting replaced. I just finished a book with my co-author, Kashyap Kampela, and he and I came to this conclusion that it not only was AI supposed to not be about lawyers and bankers and financial experts and radiologists, that all those jobs would be safe. They're not safe. And the whole idea of AI was we'd be freed up to do more things like painting and writing and the creative arts. Turns out AI can do that for us too. So, you know, double-edged sword, all of this stuff. So just to continue along, and I am aware of the time, AI and consumer law, major issue. There are major issues regarding the right to privacy. There's a case that just came out on voice imprints out of Illinois called Carpenter v. McDonald's, where drive-through takeout, takeaway, you would say in some countries, para llevar, those services, when you speak into when you're at the drive-through, you speak into a microphone, they record your voice and put your license plate, and together they're able to predict next time you come in using your voice, oh, it's James Cooper, he's driving his car, he's going to want the Big Mac and the large fries, not the filet of fish. And the issue is, do we have the right to our own voices? Not unlike how those Hollywood people want the right to their own likenesses. So these are the ongoing issues in consumer law, as well as a recent Federal Trade Commission settlement with Rite Aid, a big pharmacy chain, that deals with facial recognition. There, you see the ugly part of facial recognition technology and the kind of racial profiling that happened in some of the more inner city pharmacies where people buy food because they're food deserts, where fresh food and fresh fruit and so forth not available except in these pharmacies. The AI was being used to prevent theft, and unfortunately unable to scrape or properly analyze data, turned into some very ugly racial discrimination situations. And the Rite Aid agreed as part of the settlement not to use facial recognition technology again for another 5 years. So we're seeing in AI, increasingly the courts are getting involved, and that's because we're not getting the federal legislation I was talking about earlier. So Wild West, we're seeing regulation through actual court proceedings, not through enlightened regulation at the proactive level. And also tort law. We've heard all sorts of cases like the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration releasing reports about Tesla and other self-driving cars getting into accidents. Many of them not Tesla's fault, but they have a program called Autopilot where you can allegedly take your hands off the wheel that you're warned not to, but people are getting into accidents, hitting cars that are parked, stationary trailers and so forth, while people are playing videos or watching TV on their phones in their Teslas. And one has to ask first off, where is their head at? But also, where are the regulators? And we really need some help. Now, hopefully these high-risk activities like autonomous vehicles under the EU AI Act, we'll start to see some better regulation and some more enlightened responses from authorities to have to implement it. But watch what happens with the e-vehicles from China and the fact that technology nationalism is now creeping in. There's talk in the US of banning much of 5G and other Chinese technology for fear of spyware and so forth. So supply chain logistics, not just from that strike with the Longshoremen Association, but with respect to own goals in terms of supply chain, I think that's unfortunately going to be in our future from a national security perspective. And then finally, issues of slaughter bots. You probably have seen, if you haven't, there's a spoof video on YouTube. If you just punch in the word slaughter bot, it looks like a TED Talk. It's meant to show you what the future of warfare could look like, but using automation with respect to killer robots. And certainly international humanitarian law, jus in bello, has a lot of work to do. And it's very clear that the Hague Rules on Land Warfare might not, from 1905, are probably not applicable and need a little bit of an update. So we're seeing AI going back to that international Bill of Human Rights, both the International Covenant of Economic, Civil, and Cultural Rights, and Economic, Cultural, and Social Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both from 66, both went into force in 76. Article 1, they share. All peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. AI is a direct threat, I would argue, to that. And how's the sovereign state going to respond to this? This is the right of self-determination for peoples, not for machines. So we need to navigate that, because I think our future, if we don't think about it carefully, could be at risk. There's more about this in our new book from West Academic Publishing, Shameless Self-Promotion. You can find the website here on Amazon or pick it up from West Academic. It'll be out in 2 weeks, and it's a short and happy guide as part of their series for artificial intelligence for lawyers, and we have a new one on AI regulation and governance coming out. And I thank you for your time. Thank you, Jose and the FACAMP people and team for the invitation to the Revista Desk, and to all of you for hanging on while I spoke so quickly. Thanks, everyone.
Muchas gracias, profesor Jace Cooper.
Gracias. Y podemos esperar para preguntas o otros temas después, ¿no? La charla.
Vamos a dejar las preguntas para el final, ¿está bien?
Sí, perfecto. Sí, estoy
Perfecto.
muy
Bueno,
amable.
profesora Justine Nolan, bienvenida. Gracias por estar con nosotros.
Gracias, David. Thank you today for all of the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to be talking with you all. In particular, thank you to Jose and Danny for inviting me. So I'm based at the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW in Sydney. And today I'm going to be talking about business, and particularly the idea about how we create what we're calling transformational change with business practices. So I'm going to be looking at some of the issues that are problematic in supply chains, and then talk about the impact of new laws that are being developed around the world. And then I'm going to finish by looking at one particular case study that gives an example of how business is responding to these regulatory changes. So to start, maybe a little bit of history and how we've been working in this field. The business and human rights field has long sort of been critiqued for the, might say, ad hoc and ineffective approaches that have been pursued to sort of address corporate impacts and corporate human rights abuses in global supply chains. Really, since the 1970s, we've seen a variety of techniques used, but many have been a focus on voluntary standards and guidance, and sort of requesting companies to change, but not really having an ability to enforce that at an international level. And then in the last decade or so, we've seen a change in approach where we've been looking at the impact of legally binding obligations being developed both at national and regional levels to think about how they can and change corporate behavior. And one particular concept that is getting a lot of attention in the last decade, and more so just in the last few years, is the concept of human rights and environmental due diligence, often referred to as HREDD. And basically, this is sort of now looking at how we change things. One of the things we're grappling with now is what will be the impact of law and what is needed to incentivize companies to change. So what I want to start with is talk about three sort of key challenges or impediments to improving business practices in supply chains, which are power imbalances, purchasing practices, and sort of the structural limitations of how supply chains are set up. And commonly, these sort of are collective practices, but we also think that individual companies can operate differently to really address some of these issues. Then I'm going to talk about some of the new laws briefly, and then, as I said, talk about a particular case study we have been working on, which is in relation to Veja or Vert in Brazil, which is a French-Brazilian sneaker company, which has been setting up a really different way of operating in its supply chain, and we think provides an interesting example. So on a project I'm currently on, I'm working with two other main researchers, Professor Dorothy Baumann-Pauly from the University of Geneva, and also Dr. Andy Sumington from Sydney as well. So let me start with this sort of the barriers to changes in human rights. And the first one I mentioned is the idea of power imbalance within supply chains. This is not a new issue. People since, particularly the 1970s, 1980s, when there's been a focus on the impacts of globalization on worker rights and labor rights in supply chains, there has been an acceptance that sort of power imbalances permeate supply chains, and they're often referred to as sort of buyer-driven chains. So it's those companies at the top of this chains, which are often well-known brands, multinationals, who are able to drive the conditions and the prices and the conditions of the contract down that supply chain. And this term that is often referred to as buyer-driven reflects this power of the purchasers to basically renegotiate and restructure supply chains really according to their own priorities. And the power imbalances very much work in favor of the downstream buyers, and the suppliers, which not always, but are often more commonly in countries of the global south, are often constrained in their bargaining power. And the sort of this shift to international trade liberalization in the last few decades, the idea is perhaps it would create more of an even playing ground around that. But what we've seen is sort of this concentration of power at the top of the supply chain, which has resulted in this power imbalance. The reality is that there are many firms, particularly based in some countries, the US and Europe in particular, who might be incentivized to identify localities, the source of production, particularly Asia, Southeast Asia, where they can capitalize on and increase their profit margins on and capitalize on cheaper labor operations, and often lack of enforcement of regulation. It's not that regulation does not exist, but rather there's forces that constrain its enforcement in relation to it. And so corporations can sort of take advantage of these political conditions. Power imbalances are also relevant to the second issue that we have been looking at, which is the way that purchasing practices are being conducted and structured in global supply chains. These buying firms, which are usually, I said, at the top of the supply chain, sort of are agents of the price setting. So they're dictating the value of the goods in the sourcing localities. And the prices that are paid to suppliers are not always reflective of the value of the goods or the value of the labor, but instead more reflective of external pressures. And this can result in sort of price vulnerability in the supply chain and precarious variables that may lead to exploitation, particularly around labor. This has come over the years, I think, to sort of just been seen as an inevitable price of the way that we do business. And these impacts that I'm talking about then cascade down the supply chain. Suppliers are commonly engaged on short-term contracts, and they are always under pressure to basically demonstrate value within really limited periods to secure future work. And they have limited bargaining power to change the conditions of that contract. There has been, some very notable examples of some companies who are adjusting their purchasing practices by committing to longer-term strategic partnerships with suppliers, and how this has been very much a minority, particularly in consumer-driven goods that are being developed in supply chains. There's a pressure on both suppliers and the buyers to produce goods very quickly, to be more agile to market responses. And so we have seen, of course, this sort of just-in-time supply chain model that is operating to improve efficiency and reduce cost, but can also have detrimental impacts on the working conditions. And the third point, sort of the impediment that I just wanted to raise and note, was just the structural limitations of supply chains that many, sort of consider inherent and intractable, and, we have to work around it because there's nothing that we can do around it. And these include sort of the breadth and depth, the geographical factors of suppliers, and the multitude of tiers within this chain. So, of course, I'm talking quite generally here, and each product and good has a very different structure within a supply chain. But what we are seeing in many is that there are multiple layers between the buyer and the supplier and the sourcing of raw materials, that in each of those stages, profits get cut, the ability of the buyer to control conditions at the bottom gets loosened, and this sort of structural nature of it in supply chain has sort of, does hold inherent risks in relation to it. And also in some goods can really, the structure of the supply chain is quite complex with it. So having sort of just mentioned these three very briefly, it just gives you a sense that when we talk about regulation now, sort of regulating and improving the protection of human and environmental rights in supply chain, it is coming up against these structural problems. So it's not coming in with a clean slate and an ability to work freely. So the regulation, which is seen by some as sort of really an agent of change, which is going to transform the way supply chains operate, is going to butt up against these issues around power imbalances, purchasing practices, and structural limitations. So let me move briefly to the second part, where I want to talk about regulation as a potential lever for change. In this field of business and human rights, really, since the 1970s, there's been efforts to improve and better regulate companies, either through soft guidance measures or sometimes through national regulation as well. But the development of the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights in 2011 by the United Nations was significant in that, although again, it was in the form of soft guidance, it really started to mainstream the notion that business must take responsibility for human rights in both their operations and supply chains. So it became less of a question of should we do it, but how do we do it? So again, it wasn't, the UN guiding principles are not a binding mechanism, but they did set in place a sort of change in practice and a change in normative approach to these issues. And the more recent regulations that we're seeing in many countries around the world have really been building on this since 2011. At the time when the UN guiding principles were established, many people, sort of including myself, critiqued them as not going far enough. But the architect of the time, Professor John Ruggie, felt like, that was as far as he could go at that time. And they have many limitations in them. But as I said, they did create awareness and set a normative approach for dealing with it, and really have, in some ways, then influenced this movement, which is more recently to a stronger legal approach to regulating supply chains. So there's sort of, there's two categories which much of this new laws fall into. One is the disclosure-based approach, which is focusing on reporting, and the second, due diligence compliance regime. So this notion of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence I mentioned at the start. So in the first category, which is sort of the reporting category, some examples of this might be Canada's most recent law, which is called Fighting Against Forced Labour and Child Labour in Supply Chains, Australia's Modern Slavery Act, the United Kingdom's Modern Slavery Act, and California's Transparency in Supply Chains Act. So what all of these laws have in common, and they're quite thematically focused, is that they're requiring companies to report on the risks of, mostly in this case, forced labour and child labour in supply chains. And they're arguing that the notion of a company having to disclose means that they will change their practices. There will be this expectation of increased transparency around business activities and risk identification that will then lead to greater respect to human rights. What we've seen since really since 2010, since the California Act and the more recent Australian Canadian laws, is that this hasn't really played out in practice. They have been very effective at raising awareness with companies. Companies are starting to integrate discussion of these issues within their operations and their supply chains. But we haven't seen it always transform into practice. And this is not universal, because there are some companies that are doing very well in this regard. But the focus on reporting rather than action, and the lack of effective enforcement of frameworks with all of these laws, has meant that we haven't seen a sort of a transformative change in business behaviour. A more elaborate reporting framework that came into force in January 2023 in the European Union, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD, this again follows this mode, but it's more in depth, I would say, but it still requires companies to disclose information according to this sort of detailed set of reporting criteria, but it doesn't, again, really ask them to change the manner in which they're operating. So the second category, which I talked about, so there was the reporting category, and the other one were laws which were focusing on disclosure. The most recent example that's getting a lot of attention is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CS3D, which was developed by the Council of the European Union and adopted in May in 2024. So this directive, when it comes into force, which will be in national legislation in 2027 in the 27 EU member states, will require specified companies to conduct mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And it also proposes a civil liability regime to enforce compliance. So the distinction between these laws and the ones I mentioned earlier is that they will synergize and align with the reporting directives, but they're asking companies to take action, and they're also setting up an enforcement framework, if that doesn't happen, to then be able to follow through on that. The EU law is basically building on some other European laws that are in France, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, that have been starting to do this at a national level and dealing with their own companies and looking at their operations and supply chains. So, you know, the ability of these laws to substantially or transform corporate behavior and address these challenges that I mentioned at the start that are arising from structural supply chain issues obviously remains a big question. There's a lot of hope attached to them, but it requires a sort of a real shift in both regulatory mindset from these earlier soft normative approaches, but it also requires businesses to really embrace it, because law can be here part of the answer, but law by itself will not be the solution, because you have to involve multiple stakeholders in order to get buy-in in relation to this. So it will still require companies to really solidly engage in this process. But what these new laws are doing is sort of demonstrating this contemporary, you know, and increased appetite for using legal regulation in this way. Now, the laws that I have all mentioned are often then being imposed from these countries where the multinationals are sitting at the top of buyer supply chains down to the countries where the sourcing and the manufacturing is happening. Other countries, you know, that I haven't focused on, including Brazil and Australia, have variations of these laws that, you know, require attention and reporting from companies. And some countries also have laws that ban imports that come in that look like this. These are all complementary regimes around it. But this notion of human rights due diligence, really in its most recent form, is coming out of this EU law. So why should the rest of us care in other parts of the world? Because it will only initially focus on a small set of European-based companies, is because what will happen is that all of these European companies are sourcing products from all over the world, including, which I'll talk about in a moment, in Brazil. And these European companies are basically going to look down at their supply chain and look at the risks down in their supply chain, whether they're sourcing lithium from Chile or Australia or rubber from Brazil. And they're basically going to say to all of these companies on that supply chain, we require you now to do due diligence, and we require you to report to us on what you're doing, because that's going to be part of our risk identification. So even if the companies that are outside the EU are not caught within this law directly in the first couple of years, they will be caught indirectly. And so it is something, this new law is something we're all going to have to understand. So it really is changing the framework for companies, moving from sort of companies saying, do we actually have an obligation to address human and environmental rights, to say, okay, let's see what works. How are we doing it? At what cost will it be? And how do we collaborate on addressing these problems? So it's forcing companies to move to the how rather than the why in it. So then my sort of third and final part that I'd like to just highlight is to sort of look at a case study and say, okay, how might this work in practice? And I wanted to highlight particularly Veja or Vert's approach in Brazil as to how it's working. So Veja, as I'll refer to it, as it's referred to globally, since 2004 has sold more than about 12 million sneakers, supplying over 3,000 retailers, and operates in more than 70 countries. In 2022, it recorded over $280 million US in revenue. So it is becoming a very sizable and profitable company. But in comparison, of course, to sneaker giants like Nike and Adidas, it is still a small player. But its rapidly rising popularity and its deliberate plan to focus on human rights and environmental sustainability and its credentials on that is really starting to set it apart in an industry which has been often marred by sweatshop scandals and labor exploitation in the supply chain. So the key premise governing Veja's approach is to create a supply chain in collaboration with nature. It basically says the vision of the company is to look beyond the shoe and to look at identify how it was produced and how it may also benefit all stakeholders within this. So in a product like a shoe, it can still be quite complex. But one of the things we have been focusing on in our research is honing in, not on the whole company, but particularly looking at its rubber sourcing strategy. And when Veja started, it basically needed to build supply chains from the ground up. And it quickly identified that it wanted to source the rubber for its shoes from natural wild rubber that was coming from the Amazon. And so there are basically 4 key elements that govern Veja's business model in the Amazon and which sets it apart from other companies. The first is that it directly is sourcing raw materials. So it's sort of skipping all of those middlemen in the supply chain. Second is that it's providing financial bonus payments to incentivize rubber production to rubber tappers, the workers. Third is it's monitoring progress with innovative technology. And fourth, their approach is very much to build trust and capacity with local stakeholders to bolster their supply chain. So to take the first issue, Veja's direct sourcing of raw materials is really critical to its ability to monitor its supply chain and manage its production costs. So instead of buying raw materials from numerous middlemen throughout the supply chain, it sources and has set up relationships directly with cooperatives in the region. So rubber production, as probably many of you know, in the Amazon is largely controlled by cooperatives, which are associations of local family growers. These cooperatives, one of the largest that they work with, PUCPR, involves the members who are involved in the process, basically from the point of extraction to the sale of rubber. And so by working in partnership with these cooperatives, Veja has basically managed to maintain a consistent and high quality source of rubber, and also has invested a lot of time and money in capacity building of the cooperatives to ensure that they can market wild rubber as a sustainable forest product. Veja continues to be at the moment the largest buyer of wild rubber from the Amazon, and in the Acre region, it has really revived the rubber trade. And the second point that I mentioned at the start, one of the key elements is this provision of a bonus payment to the rubber tappers, the producers. Rubber production was at around 20 years ago, was sort of a dying industry, and the government had very much incentivized cattle in the region. What Veja decided to do was offer a rubber price that was significantly higher than the market price for rubber. And so rubber tappers get paid a bonus for sustainable production. And what the company did was work with the producers to basically develop socio-environmental standards, that if they meet these standards, which is annually monitored, that and to ensure that rubber is being produced without advancing deforestation, ensuring no forced labor is present, then workers, so that's the producer families and the tappers, receive a bonus. So in essence, Veja is paying about 4 times the market price of rubber through this process. Something they can do in part because they, unlike some other companies, don't invest heavily in advertising. And so that sort of gap in their operational budget is being put back into the production cycle. Veja has also been pioneering the use of technology to monitor its supply chain. Since 2020, it's been monitoring deforestation with satellite imaging. It's been working with the Brazilian government agency, Terra Brasilis, and it produces images that are detailed down to about 6 square meters to manage deforestation. And so rubber tappers, where there's evidence of deforestation, then become ineligible for the financial bonus. And there's a committee that is made up of producers and representatives of the company, which assesses this each year. When Veja first started monitoring, they detected significant illegal deforestation. And over the next 2 years, they found that over 2/3 of the rubber producers they started to work with would then change their processes and were respecting the socio-environmental standards and became eligible for the financial bonus. So finally, the point that I mentioned was that Veja also works strategically with a range of local actors, particularly NGOs. It has a really close relationship with PUCPR, one of the largest cooperatives in the Amazon. It also works with NGOs like SOS Amazonia to run capacity building workshops, not only for the cooperatives, but the workers themselves and their families with this. And the NGO relationship has really built a bridge in some ways and built trust between the company and local producers because they're much more present on the ground with it. So this is a case study where a company was started with this sort of a clear purpose of bringing together social and environmental goals with a successful commercial approach. And the way that they're operating is sort of being, quite clear that it is working for them. questions that we have, of course, is that whether this bespoke approach is limited to this type of product where consumers, are very much focused on the brand. More recently, we have also been having a number of discussions with Michelin, a large French tire company, because it's the tire companies of the world which are sourcing the most. They source over the 70% of the world's natural rubber. And so particularly their financial power can influence production modes. Michelin has started a similar but much smaller project in the Amazon, which is copying Veja's approach. And also they're taking aspects of it, not the whole program, to their larger production source, which is particularly in Thailand and other parts of Asia around it. So one of the things that we're looking at around these sort of, approaches, even though a company might be more bespoke in its approach, some of the questions we are asking is, how might then this be scaled to others within a sector or other sectors? So our research is sort of trying to identify companies that are taking perhaps one aspect which is quite transformational, and what is the key components of that. So for Veja, it's that local partnerships, it's sort of profit sharing, it's transparency around it. We're trying to look at the barriers to that, the drivers of it. So part of this is regulation. Veja's approach started prior to the EU laws coming into effect, but they have told us, that they are going to be very useful for them because it's going to bring others. Their goal is to bring other companies into the way they work, and regulation can help spread that. If we can find proof of concept with companies, then others may be forced to take it up through regulation, but they're keen to understand how it happens. And then the final thing we're obviously going to be measuring is how progress can be measured and how you might look at that over time with it. So thank you. I will stop there.
Muchas gracias, profesora Justine. Bueno,
Gracias.
ahora vamos a escuchar al profesor Manuel Bermúdez. Profesor, adelante, es suya la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias en primer lugar por la amable invitación. Muy agradecido con todos los participantes con sus exposiciones, las cuales han sido sumamente interesantes. Y permítame desarrollar en esta participación un tema bastante complicado y también bastante novedoso, principalmente porque al tratar un nuevo sistema normativo regional latinoamericano ante amenazas de origen criminal, lo que trato de señalar y de evaluar es que conforme todas las reglas del derecho penal, del derecho comercial, del derecho local, estas reglas prácticamente quedan absolutamente limitadas y condicionadas por factores exógenos a los países. Hoy por hoy para nadie es un secreto que la mayoría de los países, sobre todo los latinoamericanos, ávidos de recibir financiamiento, presupuesto, recursos de alguna manera económicos que le pudieran generar probablemente una mejoría en cuanto a la productividad de sus servicios o eventualmente la ampliación de sus ventajas competitivas frente a los otros países. La idea del comercio y la idea de una transacción en términos financieros internacionales es sumamente interesante. La mayoría de estas situaciones responde pues a inversiones o de grupos empresariales absolutamente objetivos y además con una lógica empresarial absolutamente determinada, pero no todo es blanco y negro. Existen una serie de circunstancias que lamentablemente perjudican el desarrollo de los países, principalmente desde el punto de vista comercial y desde una perspectiva penal. Vamos a citar algunos ejemplos bastante paradigmáticos. Lamentablemente, en los últimos años en el Perú, esto también se evidenció en Colombia, pudo tener un impacto mayor en México, tuvo un impacto significativo en Argentina, que es la vinculación de las empresas de construcción de diferentes grupos brasileños en nuestros países, sobre los cuales se ejecutaron actos de corrupción que implicaron la coordinación directa con las altas autoridades de cada uno de estos estados. Entonces, cuando nosotros analizamos el contexto del compliance y analizamos la perspectiva de cómo es que podemos desarrollar el contexto normativo en el ámbito comercial, en el ámbito civil, en el ámbito penal, desde una perspectiva de gestión pública, nos damos cuenta que prácticamente la legislación nacional quedó absolutamente limitada y condicionada, principalmente por un factor bastante especial. La ley es percibida desde una óptica y desde una visión pragmática, y la ley es vigente solo en el país donde ejerce jurisdicción un Estado. Los países latinoamericanos no tenemos una perspectiva conjunta ni tampoco una perspectiva bastante orgánica frente a las amenazas de origen criminal en nuestras esferas. Y esto implica mucho el contexto de los delitos transnacionales, ¿correcto? Y los delitos transnacionales son bastante evidentes en la esfera de nuestras realidades y por eso es que es absolutamente necesario tomar en cuenta que los estados ante esta situación en la cual la mayoría de los actos, por ejemplo, de planificación, de preparación e inclusive de ejecución, no se ejecutan en el escenario nacional, se ejecutan a través de coordinaciones, probablemente o en el extranjero, o probablemente a través de comunicaciones telefónicas o a través del uso de elementos audiovisuales. Consecuentemente, para una eventual situación de riesgo criminal, las autoridades locales quedan absolutamente, ¿qué cosa? Condicionadas en lo negativo para poder iniciar las pesquisas o las evaluaciones que pudieran determinar probablemente o el origen de una noticia criminis o probablemente el origen de una acusación. ¿Correcto? Téngase en cuenta que además en este conjunto de situaciones existen tres factores absolutamente interesantes y que además son absolutamente complejos. El primero de ellos, estamos hablando de que la movilidad del dinero o la movilidad económica que normalmente se ejecuta entre 2, 3, 4, 5 países es bastante notorio y además se ejecuta sobre la base muchas veces de coordinaciones con las altas autoridades de un Estado. Recuérdese que muchos países, sobre todo los latinoamericanos, brindan elementos legales de protección a inversiones extranjeras, los famosos contrato ley. Correcto, en el Perú, por ejemplo, un grupo inversor firma un convenio con el gobierno, firma un convenio con el Estado a efectos de garantizar no solamente la protección de su patrimonio, sino además de poder proveer los recursos tanto legislativos como administrativos para poder ejecutar los planes que supuestamente viene a desarrollar de forma lícita. No sabemos cómo es que se ejecutan finalmente estos acuerdos, ¿correcto? El segundo de ellos, adicional al elemento financiero, económico que estamos trabajando, recuérdese que hoy por hoy los estados, sobre todo los latinoamericanos, están condicionados muchas veces a una elevadísima competitividad para efectos de poder acceder justamente a la inversión extranjera. Y muchas veces esto obliga a que estos propios gobiernos modifiquen sus estructuras normativas a efectos de poder viabilizar la participación de estos grupos empresariales extranjeros que eventualmente en sus países o de repente en otros países tienen elementos negativos vinculados a actividades que probablemente no tengan el mismo elemento positivo de desarrollo. Acusaciones de repente por situaciones de infracción o situaciones de lavado de activos. Que esto, por ejemplo, ha sucedido en el caso específico del lavallato en el Perú. La ley en el Perú en el año 2008-2009 fue modificada a efectos de que se pueda admitir la contratación de grupos empresariales con procesos judiciales en el extranjero e inclusive en sus países de origen. ¿Y esto para qué? Para poder promover de alguna manera la mayor accesibilidad a estos grupos empresariales a las ofertas de licitación que se podían generar en el Perú. Esto fue un hecho notorio porque se modificó una ley que en esencia prohibía las actividades en el Perú de grupos empresariales que tenían problemas judiciales en otras jurisdicciones e inclusive no solamente problemas judiciales, sino sentencias que probablemente determinen un nivel de alta culpabilidad. En tercer lugar, frente a este tipo de situaciones, recuérdese que existe un elemento humano. Y ese es el elemento que lamentablemente ha sido bastante notorio, al menos en el Perú. Para nadie es un secreto que en los últimos años casi todos los presidentes peruanos han sido condenados. Es más, prácticamente todos. Y esto desde Alberto Fujimori, ha pasado casi 20 años preso, luego se liberó a través de un indulto presidencial, luego de él, el presidente Valentín Paniagua falleció, correcto, él no fue juzgado, pero luego vinieron todos los presidentes elegidos democráticamente y en orden, en orden continuo. Alejandro Toledo, 2001-2006, ahorita ha sido condenado por corrupción, tiene una condena de casi 25 años. Alan García Pérez se le descubrió todos los delitos que había ejecutado, principalmente con inversores extranjeros, todos estos absolutamente acreditados. Pedro Pablo Justinski, condenado, no está en situación de condena efectiva porque casi fallece al recibir la condena y pudo haber sufrido un paro cardíaco. Ollantumala estuvo investigado, estuvo preso, estuvo también con una vinculación por recibir financiamiento de parte del gobierno venezolano y últimamente hemos tenido a Pedro Castillo, ¿correcto? Entonces, todos los presidentes de la República del Perú han pasado por situaciones de acusación penal. Y esto responde principalmente a una condición bastante puntual. Las altas autoridades, al menos del Perú, y bueno, esto también se ha podido demostrar con algunos gobiernos en el extranjero, en Argentina, en Chile, en Ecuador, donde han habido bastantes elementos notorios, en Colombia, en Venezuela, en México, se ha podido evidenciar debido a que los grupos de inversión de extranjeros pueden tener un contacto directo con estas altas autoridades. Y como la mayoría de las transacciones no son de conocimiento público, luego vienen los elementos vinculados a las acciones de lobbies o a las acciones de política directa de parte de las altas autoridades respecto de la gestión pública. Entonces, la combinación de estos tres elementos supera automáticamente cualquier evaluación en el ámbito policial, en el ámbito judicial, en el ámbito fiscal y lamentablemente restringe una serie de situaciones, porque por ejemplo, solamente para mencionar, en el caso de Lavallato, ya no podemos contar con la participación, por ejemplo, de los empresarios brasileños, porque ya se quebró el convenio entre Brasil y Perú para que sus condenados por delitos de corrupción en el extranjero participen en los procesos judiciales peruanos. Ya se quebró, ya no lo tenemos. Razón por la cual muchos de los delitos que probablemente se hayan cometido se decreten en prescripción o probablemente que en una situación, acá le denominamos sobreseimiento, esto es archivo. La gran cuestión es, ya está pasando aproximadamente más de 20 años y el delito prescribe. La regla penal de la prescripción es un elemento objetivo. Pero señores, se había entendido, se había percibido el contexto del delito desde una visión absolutamente institucional sobre la cual el Estado asumía un rol para efectos de tutelar bienes jurídicos esenciales. Esta actividad solía estar en complemento con una serie de elementos de corte garantista y constitucional en el ámbito penal, que está brindado principalmente a la garantía de la presunción de inocencia, al contexto de lo que es el derecho penal ultima ratio, al fin y efecto rehabilitador de una condena, probablemente a las acciones de carácter restrictivo del derecho penal frente a las libertades de una persona. El gran inconveniente es que todo eso estaba basado en una norma de carácter y de funcionalidad en el territorio. Ya lamentablemente esto, al quebrarse con esta dinámica en el ámbito internacional, se quiebra, ¿correcto? Razón por la cual entonces los estados latinoamericanos muy probablemente, si es que no ejecutan una serie de coordinaciones internas, no podrían atender este tipo de circunstancias. Y vamos a mencionar solamente para efectos de ampliar este margen de evaluación algunos tipos delictivos que probablemente requieren una mayor, ¿qué cosa? Evaluación, sobre todo regional, lavado de activos. Hoy por hoy el contexto de lavado de activos es absolutamente un delito que es inmanejable tanto en la esfera nacional como también en la esfera internacional. Es muy difícil hacer el seguimiento de los movimientos económicos, principalmente en grupos empresariales que no tienen la visibilidad en el ámbito, ¿qué cosa? De las esferas nacionales, ¿correcto? Voy a mencionar a estos efectos en el ámbito local. La mayoría de las inversiones provenientes de una serie de industrias en el Perú que suelen tener un alto elemento de criminalidad no desarrollan actividades financieras o bancarias en el Perú. Y esto es lo contradictorio, porque en esencia el lavado de activos implica justamente una situación donde el patrimonio, el recurso financiero, es movilizado a efectos de no generar un rastro. La gran pregunta es, ¿cómo es que se puede tener actividades económicas de gran envergadura y no se tengan cuentas financieras en bancos o en el sistema financiero peruano? Evidentemente es que esto se desarrolla en el contexto internacional, ¿correcto? Hoy por hoy todo esto se puede hacer a través de redes digitales e inclusive en sistemas vía de telecomunicación por celular. Muy bien, otra actividad bastante interesante es, ¿qué cosa? El tráfico de especies, principalmente en el ámbito de la depredación, tanto de recursos naturales como de recursos de carácter de consumo humano, llámese pesca. Perú, Colombia, Ecuador en los últimos 5 años ha tenido una invasión bastante notoria de buques chinos en nuestras aguas marítimas y lamentablemente ninguno de nuestros países ha tomado alguna acción en conjunto. Recuérdese que hace menos de 10 años, Argentina prácticamente hundió un buque pesquero chino que no quiso cumplir las reglas del derecho internacional por ejecutar pesca en su jurisdicción. Tercer tipo penal que es bastante significativo en este nivel de evaluación. Señores, tráfico ilícito de drogas. Es una realidad que tenemos en países como Bolivia, como Perú, ahora Ecuador, Colombia y México. Inclusive recordemos que Perú, México, Colombia, Chile, estamos en una alianza bastante significativa y sobre la cual el comercio entre nuestros países se ha flexibilizado a tal nivel que inclusive la participación de tráfico ilícito de drogas y de lavado de activos es bastante notorio, ¿correcto? Y el último de los delitos que nosotros estamos tratando de evaluar a un nivel transnacional son los delitos vinculados, ¿qué cosa? Al impacto ambiental, principalmente por efectos de contaminación. Y esto se suele ejecutar, ¿qué cosa? En zonas de frontera o eventualmente en zonas de expansión de fronteras debido principalmente a la alta actividad de contaminación que puede, ¿qué cosa? Transcurrir o que se puede dispersar por efecto del traslado de aguas, ríos, o por efecto de los movimientos de aire que usualmente se pueden registrar, ya sea de Perú para Brasil, ya sea de Brasil para Perú, ya sea de Perú para Colombia, o eventualmente en zonas de frontera. Entonces, estos delitos no han sido analizados desde la dinámica que supere la perspectiva local y por lo tanto permiten enfatizar y detallar una necesidad regional. Una necesidad que probablemente genere muchísimos inconvenientes debido sobre todo a que esto provocará en cada una de sus jurisdicciones un severo inconveniente por cuanto estarían afectando principalmente algunos intereses de parte de quienes están encargados de ejecutar o de desarrollar estas políticas públicas respecto de sus lineamientos tanto nacionales como también en el ámbito regional. En esta perspectiva, entonces, la evaluación del impacto de los delitos transnacionales en un contexto latinoamericano nos obliga a decir, la ley, si bien es cierto, no es perfecta, tiene una gran ventaja. La ley es institucional y la ley permite al Estado desarrollarse en función a objetivos, generalmente de satisfacción de las necesidades de la sociedad. Sin embargo, la ley tiene que cumplir algunos requisitos, principalmente cuando se supera el contexto de la jurisdicción local. Bajo estas condiciones, tanto las lagunas jurídicas, tanto como las antinomias, que normalmente son los límites naturales de una ley, debería repensarse en una condición de sistema jurídico latinoamericano que ya lo venimos desarrollando conforme la jurisprudencia del Sistema Interamericano de Protección de Derechos Humanos a través de la Corte Interamericana y de la Comisión Interamericana, a efectos de que se pueda proponer un esquema al menos preliminar o básico para poder trabajar los delitos transnacionales, por cuanto esto impacta de manera severa en el ámbito del comercio, sobre todo en el internacional, como también en el contexto local respecto de las acciones delictivas que probablemente lleguen a tener un alto nivel de impunidad. En esta perspectiva, muchísimas gracias por haberme permitido participar y quedo eventualmente a la atención de las consultas que se pudieran ejecutar. Muchísimas gracias, doctor.
Manuel, muchísimas gracias a ti por tu intervención. Ahora vamos a pasar a un espacio para las preguntas. Profesora Pamplona, ¿nos ayuda usted entonces con las preguntas? Muchas gracias.
Claro que sim. Gracias, Professor Davi. Well, I'm going to start first thanking our three panelists. As I've said in the beginning, it is a star panel. And I'm going to start with Professor Cooper. Professor, I was really happy to have the chance to hear you because I have in my mind this, I've been struggling with something and I wanted to ask you, and I was a bit disappointed when you were telling us, oh, we are lacking regulation when we're talking about AI. So let me just give you the picture. When we talk about business and human rights, one of the elements that is really relevant for us is the right to information. So, and we tell people, well, the communities, the victims, the potential victims, they need to have information about what are the economic activities that companies are doing, because only with this information they can actually ask for protection from the state.
Mhm.
And only with this information they can understand what's happening. And when we're talking to, just students, and when we talk to people about this, normally they think, well, but you know what? You're talking about the right to information of indigenous people, of traditional people. And then I go to, for instance, São Paulo, it's a big city, and they think, but the indigenous people are so far away from me. So they cannot relate to this need. And I always, when I feel that, what do? I go back to tech companies and I say, look, this is important. And it's not, the right to information is not only important for people who are so far away from us, it's important for us too. And AI, I think it's one of the things, for instance, just to take one of the examples you gave us, when we talk about algorithms, this is not something that everybody understands. I would actually dare to say that most of the people do not understand what they are and how they really work. So I would say that for all of us, the right to information in this case, it's absolutely relevant. I wouldn't know what to ask for a judge if I had to explain how the algorithms are impacting one of my rights. So, but then you told us that we lack regulation. So I was wondering, is information and the right to information something that it's been on the horizon for the academics that have been studying AI or not? So this will be my question. And also, of course, I'd like to know if it is, where are we heading? How concerned they are with information. For Professor Justine, well, of course, it was, thank you too for your speech. And well, I was wondering, you were telling us, you were wondering how regulation can or cannot improve what we really want, which is, of course, that people on the ground will feel safer. And I was wondering, in what measure, to what extent both the legislation that you mentioned, either the reporting ones or the due diligence ones, in what measure do they actually tackle any of the barriers that you have mentioned in the beginning? And I could elaborate a bit, just mentioning that, for instance, if we think about the power imbalance in supply chains, I'm not sure that even the human rights due diligence legislation is tackling this. Maybe we could think about this legislation trying to tackle some of the structural limitations in supply chains, but I'm not sure. So I just wanted to hear from you. And also, I saw the report that you've produced with Dorothy about the Veja case, and I was wondering that this is the kind of corporation that it's born with a purpose, which is quite different. The purpose is there, the sustainability purpose, the purpose to do not harm. And I wonder if we talk about these corporations when we are trying to give an example, if it's not a bit misleading of the fact that we have so many others that were born years ago when we didn't talk about this kind of purpose, and they're still here. And I'm asking you that because if we take only examples like Veja, people might think that we don't need regulation because, you know, these corporations, they are here now and they are so great, and they are really concerned and they show that. But I'm afraid that we have other corporations that might still need some regulation. And so I would like to hear from you about that too. And for Professor Manuel. Professor, muchísimas gracias por su ponencia, Professor Manuel. Y a mí me gustaría saber, desde el punto de vista de nosotros que estamos nos dedicando al tema de empresas y derechos humanos, hay mucha discusión al respecto de la aplicación de la ley penal, como el señor sabe, y incluso con nuestros estudiantes, ellos están muy ansiosos por la posibilidad y por las discusiones. Y una de las cosas que nosotros siempre nos quedamos discutiendo es si la ley penal debe o no se preocupar com as pessoas jurídicas em si ou com as pessoas físicas, os gestores, os administradores de essas pessoas jurídicas. Então, eu gostaria de perguntar-lhe, em sua posição, em sua opinião, o que é que tu pensas que é mais eficaz desde o ponto de vista de la proteção de direitos humanos? Quando nós temos uma situação em que a empresa viola os direitos humanos e os outros remédios, os outros mecanismos civis ou administrativos não nos dão uma resposta que seja adequada. Muitíssimas graças, professor. Não sei, professor Davi, se respondem ou se mais alguém quer fazer outras perguntas.
Eu haré después, por favor.
Let me, if I may start, please. First off, Professora Danielle, thank you for the invitation today also with Professor Pontes, but thank you for that very thoughtful question and all your questions. Let me start by saying there's an education process that is necessary. We don't know what we don't know. And the technology clearly is moving faster than any of us can move. The irony here is that the regulators are actually slower than the academicians. I know that sounds odd for those of us in the academy because we're not used to things moving really fast. We spend a lot of time deliberating. But it's time not just for law professors to get more actively involved, but there's an education process that our regulators need. And I think that's an important piece that the academy, our colleagues, need to really think through how businesses are going to have to navigate this. Whether you're in the business of AI or whether you're in another business, you're going to use AI. So regardless, the human rights protections that I'm suggesting we need to develop and that we need to test against the first mover in terms of legislation, that being the European Union, is going to be critical. Now, that's not to say Brazil is behind on this at all. You've got a draft AI law, which was like 900 pages long, that kind of builds on your general data protection and your Brazilian strategy for artificial intelligence, the EBIA, and your internet law, your Marco Civil. So you've got some of the groundings, and I think this is where we need to think through what laws already exist that can be applied to AI rather than having to invent them brand new. So how do we take, I don't want to say old wine and put them in new bottles, but how do we use what's already there so that we can hit the ground running? In the US, we have been relying on the Federal Trade Commission. We with the Rite Aid case, we're relying on courts to do our work for us while our legislators, our regulators are asleep at the switch, we say in English. And that's not acceptable. But in that process, academicians have a huge opportunity. And keep in mind, it's not just an opportunity that's a nice to have, it's a need to have. You've got your own strategy in Brazil, for example, pre-COVID, 2019, the Brazilian strategy for artificial intelligence. Your Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation, MCTI, has created ethical guidelines. And as Professor Nolan rightfully points out, guidelines are great. Soft law, better than nothing, but you need institutions with sanctionable, punishing effect to make companies, especially the big tech companies, abide, right? Not just norms, not just rules, but enforceable, sanctionable rules that institutions can enforce and that there's penalty, not just toothless tigers. So that's sort of my call to action. And Brazil can be a leader. It's been a leader on privacy law. It's been a leader on the commercialization of the internet. It is not just a regional leader, but in Africa too, in Mozambique, in Angola, Cape Verde. There are places where what Brazil is doing will really help the rest of not just the developing world, but I think the developed world. So I remember an old expression in Portuguese when I lived in Brazil, and I can't remember, my accent will be not so good, so I'll just do it in English. There's an old expression, for my friends, everything, for the indifferent, nothing, and for my enemies, the law. And I think we need to think about that for AI. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Gracias por la pregunta, Danielle. For me, the question you first asked was, to what extent, which is a great one, to what extent does the law address these impediments? And I think you answered the question fairly well. One of the things that the EU law in particular is trying to do is to get greater engagement from the buying firms at the top of the chain with stakeholders along the chain. So there's a requirement for sort of meaningful engagement with stakeholders. Now, if this is done well, which may or may not happen, then I think it could potentially address some power imbalances, because it's asking for companies to actually engage not only with their suppliers, but workers and other NGOs and unions along that supply chain to get feedback. To do it meaningfully, you would really have to approach your engagement along the lines the way that Veja has done. And that input, if done effectively, could then alter the relationship, because it would change things like the term of the contract, potentially, that you could go from short-term, pressure-driven, just-in-time contracts to longer-term contracts with suppliers that build in a more sustainable relationship with those suppliers, so that then they start to have input on the terms of that contract around it. There'd be less of a push to do last-minute overtime when orders come in at the last minute. So this is, that's in an ideal world if the wording of the EU law is developed in a meaningful way. So I think it has the potential, but I don't think it will necessarily address all of them. I do think the idea that that would also feed into sort of purchasing practices, potentially, and depending on if a company is trying to address human rights due diligence, it is likely going to have to make its supply chain a little bit simpler. So it may reduce some of the complexity, potentially the geographical complexity. We saw that after the COVID pandemic, when some buying firms moved part of their supply chain closer to home so that they could have greater security. And they started to also diversify some of their supply chains, particularly out of China. So I think that you rightly identify it as a potential limitation, that the laws didn't really squarely address these issues, but they may indirectly address them if they're implemented well. And that, I think, leads me to the second part of your question around, what's the point of highlighting these good examples? Do we still need regulation? We both know very well that most companies don't fit into the VASIA model. And what we're trying to do with this project is put a different lens on it, because most of the time, people like you and I look at all the things that companies are doing wrong and have done wrong for the last 20 years. And what we're trying to do is show evidence of how companies can align profits with principles, and that it can be a successful mode of working. So we're trying to develop, just maybe 8 or so case studies. And the reality is, when we've been looking at the really larger multinational companies, we're not finding a whole lot of innovation, except in quite small pilot projects. And in this project, we're trying to avoid highlighting pilot projects, but rather looking at how a company has actually integrated these change into the way they operate. But the way that we're going to address your issue is that, yes, we may be focusing on more niche companies, though not all of them will be. But what part of the case studies will then say, how do you scale this? How do you replicate it? So Michelin is far from a niche company, and Michelin was not started with the idea of purpose and human rights and environmental rights. So what we're trying to talk with Michelin about is to say, how can you put into practice this VASIA model, which they're doing on a smaller scale in Brazil. And just this week, I spoke to the Asia director to say, what is stopping you doing this in Asia with your natural rubber production? So while some of our case studies will be focused on these, good or better companies, we're very much looking at the scale question to, I think, address your question about the purpose of regulation. Thanks.
Muchísimas gracias en primer lugar por la pregunta que ha formulado la doctora Danielle Pamplona. Es bastante significativa. Bueno, en el ámbito del derecho penal, ya desde la perspectiva de la dogmática en Europa, sobre todo en los países de tendencia a nuestro sistema jurídico romano-germánico, con influencia en el derecho canónico y en el derecho francés, sí se está asumiendo una perspectiva de punición contra empresas y contra personas jurídicas. ¿Correcto? Entonces, ya no solamente se sanciona a la persona natural, sino también es posible sancionar a la persona jurídica. Claro, eventualmente no con la misma cantidad ni con la misma incidencia en el ámbito de la punición. Por ejemplo, respecto a de la privación de la libertad, evidentemente a una persona jurídica no se le puede aplicar. Pero existen situaciones mucho más objetivas contra personas jurídicas respecto al punto de vista de la punición desde el ámbito del derecho penal. Por ejemplo, sanciones, tanto en el ámbito del derecho administrativo sancionador como en el ámbito del derecho penal. Ya es evidente que, por ejemplo, en el ámbito tributario, en el ámbito ambiental, en el ámbito inclusive de las regulaciones comerciales, las sanciones han tenido mucho más impacto que eventualmente las regulaciones de carácter administrativo. ¿correcto? La disolución de empresas vinculadas a actividades delictivas también ha sido bastante interesante en este nivel de evaluación dogmático que ha incidido en América Latina. Y sí, se han podido registrar empresas que han tenido que ser, ¿qué cosa? Desactivadas porque, si bien es cierto, ningún estatuto de persona jurídica o empresa va a establecer que va a delinquir, las actividades que ejecutan sus órganos directivos sí están encaminados a ejecutar actividades delictivas, principalmente, por ejemplo, a través de la negociación con funcionarios de altos niveles para la complementación de alguna actividad. Eso ya de por sí es una acción dirigida desde las altas autoridades de una persona jurídica. Eventualmente, el movimiento de dinero y la gestión de presupuestos para actividades que no forman parte del proyecto inicial. Disculpen esta pequeña interferencia, pero en la mayoría de las empresas donde se han detectado situaciones de corrupción al más alto nivel, lo más evidente es que existe lo que se denomina como caja chica. La caja chica es un presupuesto que no forma parte del fondo que normalmente maneja una persona jurídica para efectos de ejecutar un proyecto. Esa caja chica no está destinada para ello, pero forma parte de un elemento que es bastante significativo y sobre el cual se hace el seguimiento a las personas que forman parte de esta red o de esta estructura de negocios a efectos de poder ejecutar las coordinaciones tanto administrativas como logísticas para la perpetración del delito. En el Perú, por ejemplo, cuando se descubrió el tema del abayato, se detalló que prácticamente el señor Odebrecht, que fue uno de los gerentes, que ya tenía condena en Estados Unidos y en Brasil, detalló que prácticamente la gran mayoría de los políticos peruanos que habían ejercido control de determinadas entidades públicas, estamos llamando Poder Ejecutivo, estamos llamando Congreso de la República, estamos llamando medios de prensa, estamos llamando eventualmente Poder Judicial y Ministerio Público, todos ellos habían sido prácticamente, ¿qué cosa? Apoyados económicamente, por no decir otro término bastante negativo, para efectos de que puedan colaborar con estas actividades delictivas. La gran cuestión es, la persona jurídica por sí misma no puede ejecutar delitos, pero sus autoridades y sus entes directivos sí planifican actividades comerciales y actividades que tienden a generar un efecto negativo en los países o en las actividades que vayan a desarrollar. Razón por la cual sí es posible determinar algún tipo de sanciones contra estas personas jurídicas, por supuesto. En el Perú, por ejemplo, se está planteando reformar el Código Penal para efectos de establecer este tipo de sanciones. Todavía no ha sido aprobado, evidentemente porque existe una altísima oposición en el ámbito de los sectores políticos, pero a nivel teórico y a nivel institucional el Ministerio de Justicia tiene este proyecto ya prácticamente 4 años. Y las principales medidas que se han establecido para efectos de controlar las actividades delictivas de personas jurídicas, la primera de ellas es la disolución comercial y la segunda de ellas, que es para mí la parte más significativa, es el embargo de los bienes e inclusive las denominaciones de patentes y también de la denominación comercial contra estas personas jurídicas. Correcto, que a veces son las que tienen un mayor valor patrimonial cuando se ejecuta, ¿qué cosa? La evaluación del delito que se ha ejecutado en el país, principalmente para efectos de la reparación civil. Entonces, esto sería uno de los elementos que podría atender la pregunta que formuló la doctora. Muchísimas gracias.
José.
May I? Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate our guest professors for their brilliant lectures. They were of a high level, not only in terms, technical terms, but also in human reflection. And I'm a professor from the philosophy of law. And of course, I'm very glad to listen all those considerations. High standards being discussed locally and globally about justice, after all. addressing not only standards, but critical points there in Australia, in Brazil, in USA, in Peru. And these points are critically, deeply connected with our lives. And then I've tried to foster some dialogue here to listen a little bit more of your opinions. Well, what I found in common with the three presentations, James Cooper highlighted the rapid advance of AI and its associated risks. And I recently recalled a speech, a tough speech of the president of European Commission, if I'm not right, the European Union Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, expressing kind of anger and unsatisfaction with the regulatory gaps that happens that time of the speech, specifically related to big techs. She said something like, "Attention, Silicon Valley, the party is over." And she was very tough. Then came the GDPR, and recently, as mentioned, Professor Justine, the CSDDD or CS3D, that's correct, I didn't mention that way. My question is about the connection first between the two speeches. The digital world pose some risks, not only risks that appear on our screens, more like the lecture of James Cooper, what is going on in discrimination, bias, and so, of course, related to jobs too, but it's very important. But my point is, Professor Justine highlighted the CSDDD and some late effects of the John Rogers principles, and so that's the point of nowadays, very important point. The digital world also have infrastructure behind the scenes. And I have read some studies mentioning the opacity of business concerning digital firms, not only about their language, but about their accountability too, the opacity of the whole environment of digital business. Let me get to the point. My first question is the available framework, especially the CSDDD. What's your opinion, James Cooper and Justine, Nolan? Do these standards about human rights protection apply also to big tech in a broad sense? Are they eligible to enforce their behavior, the due diligence in all supply chain, let's say in this way, but I mean in other ways too, because otherwise we would say, again, there is an unregulated field. We need more regulation to big techs because their contracts are different. They don't try to respect human rights in the sense, the main topics of CSDDD. If I'm not wrong, I'm sorry, I would like to ask your opinion, just James Cooper and also Justine Nolan. If they these standards of CSTDD cover not only their productive chains of the big tech, but all digital relation, more specifically related to James Cooper's speech, freedom, information, and what happens then, yes, on our screens. Please, I would like to ask this first question. And if I may, to Professor Manuel in Spanish. Thank you also for your brilliant, muchas gracias por su ponencia. Muy interesante la idea de la nueva ley peruana que limita la actuación de las empresas extranjeras, inclusive las brasileñas que han sido condenadas por corrupción. Sin embargo, uno de los estándares recientes, más impactantes en derecho penal son varios institutos de colaboración, revisión de penas, acuerdos de leniencia, no sé si se pronuncia de esta manera en español también, leniency agreements for business. Es claro, los juristas de todo el mundo tienen la tarea de limpiar las desórdenes y encontrar las brechas, los vacíos legales o procesales para volver sus clientes, a habilitarlos a negociar nuevamente, entrar en el jugo, en las actividades nuevamente. Esto es uno de los pilares de nuestras constituciones, porque siempre se tracen los derechos liberales, por supuesto, los derechos de libre actividad económica, los derechos individuales, por así decir, de las empresas. ¿Cómo, profesor Manuel, cómo usted ve este conflicto entre las leyes que tiene este propósito muy importante, muy moralizador de las relaciones económicas, como este ejemplo de Perú, que impiden a las empresas de acceder a contratos públicos, por ejemplo, y estos otros estándares de las tendencias de negociación que orientan todo el mainstream de las libertades de las empresas. Si es posible también en su ponencia, esto restó muy claro, pensar en esta solución o tendencias para el futuro en términos regionales para todos los otros países de Sudamérica y también otros parceros. Muchas gracias, profesor.
James, do you mind if I just jump in first, because I have to, thank you very much, Jose. I have to jump off in a minute. And I will leave James to answer more fully. The quick answer around the CS3D is that technically it does apply to tech companies. The only companies that are largely excluded from it are finance companies in part of their activities. But the reality is the way that the law is structured, it really is going to focus more on hardware protection than necessarily the behavior, particularly the impact on rights of access to information and freedom of information. The way it's set up at the moment too is that very few tech companies will actually fall within the scope. I think it's like 0.01% of tech companies that will come within it because of the way it's structured and its European focus. So in theory, yes, it should be companies doing human rights due diligence. It should be companies looking at risk, and that should include looking at the risks that companies pose around misinformation, around that. I think the reality is that many tech companies will focus more on the production angle and look at hardware angle first and less on the other, even though technically it's within scope. But I'll hand to James for sort of maybe a more nuanced version of how law works or not works in relation to tech companies and these rights. And I will drop off in a minute, so thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Nolan, and for your question, Professor Pontes. Here's, I wanted to be slightly cynical and say, the fines that the big tech companies are being forced to pay in the EU so far is minuscule compared to their huge profits. So it's just the cost of doing business. And I think that's a sad state of affairs when you just factor in that Andreas Mundt and the anti-cartel group in Germany or the EU or whichever watchdog that's looking at that particular day, going after whatever particular big tech company on the new product, that it's just a transaction cost, and that the morality of it, the ethical guidelines, the shareholder long-term interest, corporate social responsibility, any of those other soft law, nice to haves, but not need to haves that Professor Nolan kind of went through in terms of how ESG works or how CSR works. I think it's a real challenge to regulate in Europe today. Now, there was hope up until last Sunday in the US. That's when Gavin Newsom in California, the governor, vetoed an AI bill that would have at least put in some protections. And he vetoed it he says because it was too broad, it was not broad enough. I'll leave it to others to decide why it was that he vetoed it. But I think politics and I think sometimes outside economic interests with respect to fundraising is a piece of the puzzle that we always have to consider. Luckily, Europe doesn't have that same transparent issue facing it. But it does have a different issue. Its industry is not large enough to merit having first mover status on AI regulation. The real players in the game are the US and China, and often both together, jointly filing patents. Scientists from both, money from I was in a meeting a few days ago with the modern father of AI, Kai-Fu Lee, and he's very interested in and he's Taiwanese, but doing a lot of work obviously in China. Used to work for Apple, for Google, and he's got a new AI search engine called Bigo that's going gangbusters. And the exciting part of what he's doing is he's trying to bridge cultures and bridge legal systems. And I think that kind of legal interoperability is going to be critical. And by Gavin Newsom not following what the EU is doing and leaving it now to other states to have to be first mover here stateside, I think is a vacuum that's going to be hard to fill because California followed the GDPR in terms of its own privacy rules. So the short answer is we don't want to be in a situation of social dumping like in the blockchain world where a lack of regulation, a Wild West approach becomes a strategic advantage. And I think that increasingly, we need to do what we can. Countries like the BRICS, like Brazil, countries like India need to take a leadership position to force the hand of the bigger players and the bigger market movers so that AI race of regulation, the race for AI regulation, it becomes not just a beauty contest, but becomes a reality so that we're all protected.
Muchas gracias, doctor José Pontes, por la amable pregunta, pero es bastante complicado darle una respuesta automática. Lo que sucede es que recuérdese que en el derecho penal, por cuestiones constitucionales y por cuestiones también de obligaciones internacionales, se privilegia el principio de legalidad, razón por la cual, cometido un delito, la norma aplicable es la que está vigente en ese momento. Las posteriores reformas no aplican ni en el ámbito de la investigación ni en el juzgamiento, razón por la cual muchos de los delitos que se pudieron haber ejecutado, por ejemplo, en un periodo preliminar hace 2 o 3 años, no pueden ser evaluados conforme las modificatorias legislativas penales para justamente esos delitos. Entonces, ya de por sí tenemos un primer límite basado en el principio de legalidad que restringe la aplicación del jus puniendi del Estado en este tipo de situaciones. Sin embargo, lo que debemos tener en cuenta es que el derecho penal no es el único elemento o instrumento para poder aplicar una evaluación en este tipo de circunstancias. En el Perú al menos tenemos tres elementos complementarios entre sí. El primero de ellos es la legislación de carácter administrativa que suele estar vinculada al ámbito de las contrataciones públicas. En este caso, respecto a la legislación de las obligaciones del Estado peruano con respecto de las inversiones extranjeras, más exactamente respecto de lo que es inversión extranjera, ¿correcto? En este tipo de situaciones, si bien la ley ha cambiado dependiendo de las acciones que se han tenido que superar supuestamente en términos para promover una mayor inversión, en realidad ya se demostró que estas fueron modificadas para efectos de que puedan participar algunas empresas con el objeto de poder generar un acto ilícito. El segundo de ellos es el propio derecho penal. Y el tercero de ellos es el ámbito del derecho civil. Debido a que normalmente la actividad delictiva es mucho más rápida y es mucho más eficaz que la intervención del Estado, ¿qué es lo que ha sucedido en los últimos años, al menos en el Perú? Tomando en cuenta que es muy difícil esta interacción entre los tres elementos normativos que le acabo de indicar. Muchas empresas, a sabiendas que van a tener inconvenientes en el ámbito de la investigación a sus funcionarios, han optado por vender o ceder su participación en los consorcios empresariales en los que participan a terceras empresas, ¿correcto? Razón por la cual ya el patrimonio que usualmente podía tener una empresa en el extranjero, en el Perú, queda absolutamente en resguardo porque ya se retira. Y al no tener participación en el Perú, la criminalización, la investigación y el juzgamiento de este tipo de actividades delictivas es mucho más restringida, porque imaginémonos a un juez peruano convocando a presuntos implicados en la ejecución de algún delito que residen en el extranjero, probablemente sea muy complicado para ese juez que estas personas asistan a las audiencias. Entonces, ya de por sí se genera un gran inconveniente. ¿Qué es lo que detalla entonces el tercer cuerpo normativo para evaluar este tipo de situaciones? El contexto de la responsabilidad civil y el contexto de lo que significa la nulidad de contratos por cuanto quiebran un principio básico en todo Estado de Derecho, que es el de no actuar conforme a la legislación y eventualmente manipular el concepto de la buena fe comercial. En ese tipo de situaciones, a veces, inclusive, el derecho civil es mucho más eficaz que el derecho penal, porque en este tipo de circunstancias es absolutamente acreditable la ejecución de actos que atentan contra los negocios y contra la buena fe comercial, debido principalmente a la acreditación de algunos elementos complementarios con los cuales sí es posible encontrar alguna solución a este tipo de actividades. El gran inconveniente es, insisto, primero, la alta especialización. No todos los profesionales conocen de las tres especialidades, del derecho civil, del derecho administrativo y del derecho penal, razón por la cual la propia evaluación desde, por ejemplo, el Ministerio Público es sumamente complicada. Dos, estos tipos de situaciones necesitan acreditarse a través de información documentaria, cosa que a veces es absolutamente limitada porque la documentación oficial suele vincularse solamente a actividades de carácter absolutamente lícito. No está acreditada una situación absolutamente ilegal o criminológica. Y la tercera de ellas es acreditar las evidencias que pudieran vincular o desarrollar una actividad delictiva. Por ejemplo, los movimientos económicos a través de depósitos en el contexto internacional, que a veces también son restringidas, pero son las más evidentes, ¿correcto? Ahora viene otro gran detalle. Normalmente, y esto disculpen la referencia, es muy complicado que una persona que va a delinquir de su cuenta en el extranjero para que le ejecuten un depósito. Eso no suele pasar. El gran detalle está que estas personas suelen tener familiares o se desarrolla pues una actividad complementaria a lo delictivo para que puedan ejecutar este tipo de actividades. Por eso es que la mayoría de los hijos de personas corruptas o los familiares directos de personas corruptas o las personas afines o las que han desarrollado una actividad laboral muy próxima son las que tienen estas cuentas. Y ahí es donde se puede desarrollar este tipo de indagación. En el Perú, por ejemplo, cuando se destituyó a Alberto Fujimori, se identificaron a todas las personas que habían trabajado en su entorno próximo junto con Vladimiro Montesinos y se llegaron a descubrir más de 300 cuentas de depósitos bancarios en el extranjero, casi todas en Suiza. Ahí se logró determinar efectivamente pues una red vinculada al crimen organizado desde la presidencia de la República del Perú. Entonces, como casi todas estas cuentas eran de personas que no podían acreditar los altos ingresos y las altas sumas que tenían depositadas, todas estas cuentas finalmente fueron, ¿qué cosa?, confiscadas a favor del Estado peruano. Pero eso ya no viene desde la perspectiva penal, eso ya viene desde otra perspectiva, ¿correcto? Entonces, probablemente la complementación de todas estas especialidades pudiera provocar en el tiempo la ejecución de una legislación mucho más orgánica que pueda viabilizar no solamente la norma de carácter internacional, sino también las normas de carácter estadual en cada uno de los países para efectos de poder tener una alternativa frente a un delito que probablemente ya nos ha superado. Porque esto, señores, ya es una evidencia y lamentablemente lo que ahora tenemos que evaluar es cómo poder solucionar estos inconvenientes. Muy agradecido.
Thanks. Obrigado. Gracias. Hoy hemos tenido un evento del más alto nivel. Gracias a nuestros invitados, gracias a la profesora Pamplona, al profesor Pontes, a Facampi, por este espacio. Frente a los retos globales, sea la implementación de la inteligencia artificial, sus sesgos, sus sus defectos, etcétera, etcétera, o frente a la responsabilidad ambiental de las empresas o el delito transnacional, al ser problemas que nos competen a todos, pues las soluciones deben ser también en conjunto. Por eso es importante un espacio como este y agradezco a todos los que nos acompañaron, a los asistentes. Profesora Pamplona.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor David. Eu também só quero agradecer a todos os nossos ponentes por nos brindar com tão importantes observações e agradecer mais uma vez, professor José Pontes, por la invitação. Gracias.
Gracias a todos. Mucho gusto. Ha sido un suceso. Thanks, James Cooper, for your presence. We have been discussing for more than 2 hours here. Thank you. Obrigado. Gracias, David Mendieta y profesora Danielle Pamplona por su coordinación. Y también, James Cooper, thanks for your co-coordination with us. Profesor Manuel Tapia, fue un honor tenerlo con nosotros. Esperamos que tenha sido solo la primera vez que tenemos este encuentro, que tengamos otras oportunidades fructíferas como esta. Muchas gracias. Encerramos entonces con nuestros cumplimientos a todos. Muchas gracias.
Como Soda Stereo dice, gracias totales.
Thank you.
Obrigada.
Bye, bye.
Chao, chao.
Bye, bye.
Hasta luego. Bye.